Hello and welcome everybody to this Administrative Data Research UK Research Symposium focusing on climate and environmental sustainability. I'm very grateful to have been invited to chair the session today. My name is Ian Townsend. I'm lead in the ONS, Office of National Statistics, on environmental economy. We produce a range of statistics focusing on how the environment affects the economy and how the economy affects the environment, which includes things like measuring the green economy and green jobs, also annual and quarterly measures of greenhouse gas emissions, and also economic valuation of the benefits we gain from our natural capital resources. I also chair a government stat service-wide environment, climate and nature theme group, which brings statisticians and analysts together from central and devolved governments and their arm's length bodies to look at data gaps and collaborate. And one of the things that you might be interested to hear about is that we are planning to publish a new compendium of official stats that are published in this topic by the end of the year. So with both of those hats on, I'm really keen to hear what our researchers here have to say today. A few things about ADR before we get started. For those who have not come across ADR UK before, it's a 4 nations partnership covering each of England, Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales, and also the UK-wide Office for National Stats, looking to change the way that researchers across the UK, researchers access UK public sector data. Supported by UK research and innovation, by safely and securely linking together de-identified data sets held by different parts of government, ADR aims to enable better informed decisions that can improve people's lives. I suspect people on the call may already know what administrative data is already, but just in case this is not the case, this is information created when we interact with public services such as schools, the NHS, the courts, or the benefit system, for example, which is then collated by government. So ADR does this work in part through a dedicated commission research fund, and those on the call today may be interested to know that ADR are also soon going to be inviting applications for research fellowships with a series of webinars coming in the next few weeks. Details will be shared in the chat. So a few things on housekeeping before we get going. We'll have time for a short break about halfway through today's meeting. I'm expecting to wrap up around 3:40 or so this afternoon. Unless you're presenting, please keep your cameras and microphones switched off unless you are actually presenting. And we're looking for interactions today though, so please post your questions in the Teams questions and answer function at the top, where we'd like, and then I can put those questions to the researchers in each section. Also, the meeting chat will be running throughout the call, so if you did want to add any thoughts or links inspired by what you hear, then please do, but please do put any questions that you'd be hoping for a response on into the Q&A section. So a brief introduction to the theme today. Climate and sustainability is one of 8 ADR UK core strategic research themes. While our green economy work at the ONS has tended to be focused on business surveys, we're often asked for more granularity in our statistics, as well as producing them faster and more regularly. So we're really increasingly looking to see where novel data sets can enhance our work or produce new insights, such as through linked data. So the ADR theme here intersects with a wide range of topics, with a noticeable focus on how admin data can offer new insights in health, transport and agriculture in particular. Along with the research we'll be hearing about shortly, 2 ADR projects caught my eye as I prepared for today. One is looking at green jobs, linking a database called ONET that looks at jobs from a task perspective with earnings and census 2011 data. And that's one I've shared with our team because I think they'll be very interested to read about that one. And another is about connecting admin vehicle data for research on sustainable transport, which is linking DVL data on vehicles and where the register keeper lives with MOT data, including engine type and distance travelled each year. Grabbed my attention because I recall this very linkage coming up in the team conversation a couple of years back. So, and something we didn't have resources to do in-house. So we're looking forward to see that happening and that it's being enabled by ADR funding. Anyway, we're here today to listen to 4 researchers, one from each of the different parts of the UK. So first up, we've got Professor Chris Dibben, who's Director of ADR Scotland and chairing geography at the University of Edinburgh, as well as Director of the Scottish Longitudinal Study. Chris is going to be sharing some insights from research on active travel in Scotland, including around links between cycle commuting and mental health. So Chris, it's over to you. Thank you.
Great, thanks Ian. Don't know what I did there. We try and share again. Good. Can you see my slides okay?
I can. Hopefully everybody else can too. Over to you. Thanks.
Great, thanks. Yeah, thanks, Ian. So I'm going to cover today some research that we're carrying out in Scotland. As with all these things, of course, it's a wider team than just me. And here is some of the research team. I should also point out, though, that this work has been developed and the research very much done in interaction with colleagues in Scottish Government, Transport Scotland, which is the body that really looks into this area, and also organisations like Sustran and local government, including the cities of Edinburgh and Glasgow. So this is looking at the area of active transport. You'll see that actually the last example that we're developing and will be working on, it goes a bit beyond that and looking more broadly at transport and young people, but I'll come back to that in a moment. Okay, so it probably doesn't require, given the audience we'll have today, to say why active commuting is of research interest. It's cheap, healthy, and importantly contributes to zero carbon and also the related issues of sustainable cities. Now, the research I'll just cover briefly this afternoon is research we've already carried out, some new findings that is ongoing research, and then I'll talk a bit more about research that we're moving it onto. So the research we've already carried out is looking at cycle commuting amongst adults, which links the 2011 census to health data sets. And that's work where we look and show what we believe is a causal relationship with mental ill health. We've been building recently on that work and in fact using the instrumental variable that we discovered in the earlier work to look really at factors that lead to higher levels of cycle commuting. So what might a city focus on in terms of encouraging more active commuting, but specifically cycle commuting? And then I'll move on to then the work we're about to start on, which includes the data from the 2022 census. Luckily for us in Scotland, because we delayed our census, that our information within the census on commuting was post the period where everybody was working from home. So usefully then our new census then gives us information. And I'll talk a little bit more about how we're broadening that work. But first of all, then talking about this first piece of work that we've carried out on commuting and mental health. And this was published last year in the International Journal of Epidemiology. And as I said, it's looking at, and within this piece of work, we make the argument about a causal relationship between cycling and mental health. Now, this work used the fact that in the UK censuses, we ask about how people get to work and indeed get to school for younger people. We ask for the main form of transport, so we can pick up, obviously not perfectly, but the main mode that people will use in terms of their movement to work. And what we did was we looked at this in Edinburgh and Glasgow. We linked the census data to prescribing data, and particularly we looked at whether people were being prescribed at all for drugs related, anxiolytic drugs or antidepressive drugs. So in other words, we were using a measure of being prescribed these drugs as a measure of mental ill health. Now, importantly, and this is really why we were able to make the case that this was a causal relationship. Although we did have information on whether someone commuted or not, and the mental health as measured through prescribing, we also had the possibility of using an instrumental variable. And this is, for those that you're not familiar, is a method that approximates a trial, a randomized controlled trial. And in this instance, what we did was we explored whether distance to a cycle path was independently related to whether someone cycled or not. Independently of other factors that might confound that relationship, we found that there weren't factors that predicted cycling that were also related to where people lived and whether that was close to a cycle path. And equally importantly, we found that living near a cycle or nearer a cycle path increase your propensity to cycle. And we obviously return to that in our piece of work that we're going to talk about. So the importance of cycle paths in terms of encouraging cycling. But in this instance, we were just using it as an instrumental variable, this slightly stronger way of looking at the relationships that then allows you to make a case that this is a causal relationship, not just an association. So in this work then, we also identified actually just the rate of cycling amongst working age adults. And you can see the figures for Glasgow, almost just about 2% and 5%, so quite low in 2011 for the census that we used. So one of the things we're going to do is look, as I said, at 2022 to see whether that rate increased. We believe it will have done, but it'd be nice to measure that. Now, amongst those cycling, we found that those that didn't cycle, the prescribing rate, so our measure of the person suffering from anxiety or depression, was greater than non-cyclists. But of course, this could well be a confounded relationship. You know, perhaps people that were experiencing depression found it harder to be active and cycle to work. So obviously there was a need to use an analytical approach. And as I said, what we used was an instrumental variable. And using this instrumental variable, then we estimate that those people that were living close to a cycle path, in this case it was within 800 meters, were 15% less likely to be experiencing mental ill health. And as I said, because this is an instrumental variable that seemed to meet the assumptions of that kind of analysis, we can make the quite strong claim that this is probably a causal relationship. And interestingly, when we ran a model looking at cycle commuting and mental health, but controlling for all the number of factors that we could measure in the census that might also predict mental ill health, we found a very similar level of a similar effect. So that was the study that we've done. So moving now on to the piece of work that we're actively engaged with, which is the question of propensity to cycle. There's a natural progression here, obviously, with the fact that we were using proximity to cycle paths in our instrumental variable. So understanding what might encourage cycling is of obvious interest to the many organisations that intersect with this kind of areas, particularly local authorities that are having to make difficult choices about spend, but have targets around zero carbon and being a sustainable city. So active commuting then and the factors that might encourage it then are of great interest. So from the literature then there's a whole set of factors that are thought to be important. Obviously demographic effects like sex, age, income and employment status, but also things to do with the environment, in particular the structure of cities, so the distance to work, so how close people live to work, but also importantly for us, the cycling infrastructure. So on-road cycle ways, but also importantly off-road. And we were hypothesizing ahead of this work that off-road, particularly given its increased safety, would be a particular factor to encourage cycling. So the data that we used is an extension of the data we'd used in the earlier studies. This is linking census data to health records, and in particular the spatial link of where somebody lives and where somebody works to proximity to work, so the full total distance to work, but also importantly distance to different types of cycle infrastructure. So this data set allowed us then to look at both this relationship with its cycling infrastructure, but also other socio-demographic factors that might impact propensity to cycle. Just to give you some idea of what that looks like for the two cities we're looking at, so Edinburgh on the left-hand side of your screen and Glasgow on the right, you'll see the yellow and green lines, which are the cycle infrastructure as was around 2011 when we had our data on the methods of commuting. You'll see that in both cities there's quite a good network of, in yellow, off-road and the green colour on-road. And you can see in the shades of green going from lighter, which is less cycle commuting, through to dark, that the level of cycle commuting varies perhaps a little bit more in Edinburgh. And one thing you'll note is that the closer a person lived to the city centre, the more likely they were to cycle. So this obvious strong relationship with distance to work as an encouraging factor. The patterns are a little less strong in Glasgow, but you'll see in a moment that when we model this, that these relationships exist in both cities. So just to twist this round, really just to show you the strength of this kind of linked administrative data, from the census we also can tell, given the workplace, how likely somebody was to cycle into work. And again, probably the notable thing, maybe a little bit more so in Edinburgh, just because it has a very definite centre, the rates where your place of work is in the centre and near cycle pathways, there's an increasing rate. But just this useful piece of information that we can look at both how close somebody's home is to cycle paths, but also how close their work. And in fact, it may be, we hypothesize, more likely that cycle paths close to work may be more important, given the fact that the roads may be busier around a place of work. Okay, so this is the relationships between the different characteristics of individuals and whether they're likely to cycle to work. I haven't got time to go through all of these. You can probably read them as I'm speaking, but the main one of interest in terms of this particular talk then is the proximity to a cycleway. So that first coefficient is the decrease in the likelihood of cycling for every 1 kilometre further away you are from a cycle path. So about a 15% decrease in your likelihood of cycling. Then the next two are interesting, particularly because of our earlier hypothesis. So looking at that same 1 kilometre difference, there's the strength of off-road cycling is more important than on-road. In other words, the encouragement of being on off-road leads to a greater increase in the likelihood of cycling. Not a huge difference, but a difference there. When we've looked at relationships depending on sex, we actually find a difference with female cyclists more likely to cycle. Females more likely to cycle if they're near an off-road cycle path, which is again an interesting finding. So just to turn then in the last 5 minutes to the new projects we're working on. As I noted earlier, we're going to look now in using the 2022 census with the same question on means of transport to work. This allows us to look at the changing picture, also to confirm or not our earlier findings around the impact of cycle pathways, given both changing cycle networks, but also the different culture of cycling. Now we're going to, in this part of the work, extend beyond just looking at mental health, particularly because we found this causal model. So what we aim to do is to look at a much broader set of health impacts of cycling beyond just mental health. In other work with other colleagues, we've already shown this actually in a more traditionally modelled framework. But the nice thing here is that we can be more confident of a causal relationship. So the idea here is to try and look at the wider health impact of cycling. And this is really to tie in with my last bullet point, which is that we're trying to look at the economic value of building cycle pathways. As I said earlier, these are infrastructure that have to be put in by local authorities that have lots of budgetary pressure at the moment. So the more we can show that an investment in a section of cycle paths will have a wider saving, in this instance, both to the individual in terms of their own health, but to the NHS in terms of costs of healthcare, the easier it is to justify the expenditure on the cycle pathways. We're also going to look at active transport among school children, and this is work we hope to do with colleagues in Wales, actually closely related to the work you're just about to hear about. But just to turn to this idea of a changing infrastructure, you can see here the original cycle lanes that we used in our initial study in green. And then you can see perhaps a little bit more for Edinburgh, the extensions up to today. So hopefully we can explore further the impact and perhaps in a sort of time-dependent sense of increasing cycle paths and whether that has a similar impact on likelihood of cycling. The final study we're looking at in this work strand, as I said, this is not so much active travel, but is the fact that in Scotland, all young people under the age of 22 have free bus transport. This was a policy that started in 2022. It's an expensive policy, and therefore Scottish Government and Transport Scotland are keen to understand its impact. So that's what we're going to do. So we're going to look at the effect of free bus transport, and we're going to use the fact that this was introduced in 2022, and there's obviously cohorts effects as you become eligible or not eligible to for this free bus transport, and also again probably working with ADR Wales to look at the fact that in Wales there's a different policy where there's a subsidy for young people's bus travel, but not a covering the total cost. So we can contrast similar areas in Scotland and Wales in a sort of quasi-experimental approach. So our main outcomes we're interested to see if there's an impact is on employment and training. Does the lower cost encourage young people to maybe stay on in education or take up employment that might be too expensive if there was a high commuting cost? We're also interested to look at the accident hump, the fact that particularly young men, if they immediately get a car age 17, have a very high, compared to the rest, all other ages that are likely they'll be in the future, to have a car accident. So whether both the increasing costs of car ownership, but also in Scotland the reduced cost bus transport, then postpones or maybe even removes this accident hump. Also look at that in terms of its impact on different areas, and like Wales, we're interested to understand its impact on rural young people. Okay, just to finish off then, as I noted then, this is work that we've done in conjunction with Scottish Government, and this is directly reflects the kind of indicators that Scottish Government is judging its own performance on. So in terms of improving public health, and you can see the ones that directly are understood more through our research, and also improving the environment. Again, a set of outcomes that we can look at in this research. But hopefully I've given you an idea of the research that's carrying on in Wales, but possibly equally important, the kind of data available through ADR UK and how you can use it to explore these kind of questions. So thanks very much.
Fantastic. Thanks, Chris. Couple of questions are in the Q&A. Just a quick one from me. I was quite interested in the 800-meter line you put around the infrastructure. Just wondering, did that come from some other research? Just be quite curious. It's something that we think about quite a lot in natural capital accounts that we produce. So thanks.
Yeah. So it was actually looking at the changing risk. So we could have looked at a continuous measure, but basically there's an inflection point around 800 meters to 1 kilometre away, and I think there's quite a lot of agreement in the literature to those people that have looked at it that that's a sort of a critical point. But yes, we found an inflection point where the effect of the cycle path seemed to really drop off, and so that was the reason for 800 meters. But it in a lot of ways 800 meters is an important distance in terms of commuting. Other than obviously if you're using a car or a motorised forms of travel.
Sure, thank you. Okay, so over to questions in the Q&A. We've got one from Joanna, which is, what about the topography of the city, noting that sort of flat versus steep roads, and noting that Edinburgh is quite steepy?
Yes, yeah. So no, we didn't take that in account. However, that's certainly something, and we were just discussing actually last week whether we can do that. That there's an issue that those of you that have worked with the Ministry of Data and sort of spatial data will be aware of. That there's a sort of a balance in terms of privacy and disclosure control about how easy it is to move spatial data. There's also constraints in terms of because we're working in a TRE, the kind of space, compute and storage space that's available. But lots of research has shown that's important. I guess our assumption was that wouldn't be confounding the relationships that we saw, but we do think both the weather and actually Glasgow is quite steep as well, and so possibly the lower level of Glasgow we think is probably a combination of steepness, slightly less good weather, but also the fact that the sort of 1960s planning for Glasgow had very busy roads going through the centre. So on the whole, cycling is is more likely to lead you to being engaged in heavy traffic.
Okay, thank you for responding to the question. Got another one from Laura, who asks, have you or are you planning to engage with local authorities around the findings from your research, e.g. to inform their infrastructure planning?
Yes. So we're working closely with Transport Scotland, that has the overall responsibilities for the policies in this area. We're also working with the charity Sustram, which obviously it provides cycle infrastructure either through grants or its own fundraising, and therefore has an interest in this area. And the City of Edinburgh at the moment, but that's really just because there's a broader set of work that we're engaged with, but equally with Glasgow. I mean, you probably noted we just looked at 2 cities, and that was really just because of the scale of integrating, doing the distances for everybody in the city to the nearest cycleway, which is not a small piece of work, and was, I should acknowledge the work of National Records of Scotland that enabled that to happen. But yes, one hope would be we'd look at other councils as well, council areas, more likely urban areas.
Sure. Thanks for that. And a question from Pia. Note that this is all very fascinating research, but is it more expensive to provide free travel for children and young people than older adults? Has the free travel for older adults been evaluated in the same way?
When you say older, do you mean OAPs?
Isn't there a 60+ free travel?
Yes,
policy?
well, that's a really interesting point. We hadn't considered that, but so more expensive in the sense of,
well, the young people probably use it to get to school and work, right? And older people not. So what's the, like, why is that? Why is the young? It was just, you said, oh, it's a very expensive scheme. Well, I would have thought that the scheme for older adults was pretty expensive.
Yeah, well, I think both. Yeah, both are. So no, thanks for the pointer. Yeah, we hadn't really thought about the over 60s, 65s, whatever the age limited.
It's 60 in London anyway. I think it's a lot of whom are very wealthy. So that's the sort of anyway. Yeah, I was just asking if you're gonna do both, like, sides of the age spectrum, basically.
No,
The
thanks for that
data
point.
amazing.
Yeah, we'll have to. I'll discuss it with Caroline. Yeah.
Thank you. There's one more question, and we haven't got much time, so Chris, if you could respond to this one as quickly as you're able to. But this is from the chat. But how is an on-road cycle lane defined in Scottish cities? How did the extent of the networks in Edinburgh and Glasgow compare to London's, for example, in terms of density?
Yeah, so it was purely in terms of the GIS that we were using. So on-road at that point was largely just segregated lanes. Now, as in other cities, there's far more segregation from the travel, including bollards, and off-road was entirely off-road. Okay.
Well, thanks very much, Chris. That was great. Thanks for the questions, and hopefully Chris's answers have been really helpful as well. So without further ado, we'll move on to our next set of speakers. So we have Samantha Turner and Dr. Dora Pouliou from Swansea University, who are respectively a senior data scientist and a senior research officer there, who have been looking at the distance children travel to school in Wales through ADR themes of climate change and health and well-being. So I think Samantha is up first. So both of you have around 15 minutes. So over to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Ian. All right. Okay. Okay, is that visible?
It is for me.
Okay? Yeah, awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. So my name is Sam Turner. I'm a researcher from Swansea University. I work for ADR Wales climate change theme, which this work has been funded by. I'm just going to give an overview of the work we've been doing, looking at the distance that children travel to school in Wales. Just also mention I'm part of the environment and health team at Swansea University as well, which lots of the authors are part of that too. Okay, so just to give a bit of background, the distance that a child travels from their home to the school is one of the key factors that influences whether they'll opt to travel or not. And another factor that distance is involved with in Wales, there's a bill in Wales called the Learner Travel Bill. And this basically states whether a child is entitled to free transport, and this is based on distance. So for primary age children, they can have free transport if they live over 2 miles, and for secondary over 3 miles. So we started having a look at the distance data, and it was a bit patchy across Wales, and it was quite limited. So there was good data in some local authorities and none in others, and no way to kind of bring these data together and compare them. And we suddenly thought this might be something that we could bring together using a combination of doing geospatial work outside of our SaIL data bank and work inside. And we thought it's really important to get this kind of data together, as it's real key baseline data that can then go to inform the planning and evaluation of both effective but also equitable active travel and sustainable travel policies and interventions. And as Chris has given an overview, increased active travel and sustainable travel has been associated with lots of beneficial outcomes. So improved health and education, lower admissions, improved air quality, particularly around schools when you have all that kind of busy drop off, and then greater inclusion, just opening up ways that children can travel that isn't reliant on cars. So the aim of our research was to establish the homeschool distances for all children across Wales attending maintained schools. Unfortunately, we didn't have additional learning needs specific schools or private schools. And it was to kind of generate this comparable national data that can then inform policy and practice in Wales. So we used a combination of geospatial work outside of our secure SaIL data bank. And what we initially did was calculate the shortest network distances. So this was based on roads and paths that could be used between the child's home and school. And we did this for all properties in Wales. And we generated distances to all schools for every property within 50 kilometres. So this resulted in a very large data set, which was fun to initially analyse, which was 640 million origin and destination pairs. And then using our third trusted partner and our SaIL split file approach, we de-identified these distances and then uploaded them into our SaIL data bank to establish the correct distance for each child. And just in case you're not familiar with the SaIL data bank, it's basically a secure, anonymised, population-wide data repository that we can use to link billions of records across health data, administrative and environmental data, such as this case that we can bring in, enables us to do secure research that will hopefully benefit the public. So I've just done a little exemplar of the distance data. So we have the UPRNs, which is a unique property number for all residences, the unique school number, and then the distance. So this was our 640 million table, and then we brought that into SaIL, where then our unique property numbers are de-identified and converted into a RALF. The school number was encrypted, but we then still retain the distance for those two variables. And then in SaIL, we created a 2020 cohort. We'll shortly be updating that for 2022. And this contained all school-aged children attending a maintained school in Wales. And we did this by using the education dataset in SaIL. And then this is just like a simulated kind of table of how the data looks like. So the columns highlighted in green, these came from our education dataset. So we have the child's anonymised number in our dataset. We have the encrypted school ID, the school medium. In Wales, we have different languages of schools. You have English, Welsh medium, sometimes by I think there's about 6 different language categories. We had school religion, and then from the Welsh Demographic Service dataset, which is our kind of core dataset in SaIL, which is a register of all people registered with a GP practice in Wales. We then identified the child's anonymised residence in 2020, along with other demographic details. And then once we had the anonymised residence and the encrypted school number, we could then go to that 600 million table and actually identify the correct distance for that child. So an overview of the kind of cohort and the outputs that we're generating from this. So we have a 2020 cohort with 367,000 children in it, aged 4 to 16 years old, and 1,400 schools, of which 72% are based in urban areas. So one key output is our stakeholder and policy output. We're shortly going to submit an ADR data insight. And the focus of this is kind of the descriptive analyses of these data, presenting results by the local education authority level, individual school level, and then the LSOA to inform policies and interventions around active sustainable travel. And then we've also done some statistical analysis that we'll be publishing on shortly, which is looking at what factors are associated with home to school distance. So looking at deprivation, school medium, school religion, ethnicity, and additional educational needs. And we split the analysis into primary and secondary education, and also urban and rural, as they're quite different needs and infrastructures around these different groupings. And just the stats bit, we did a GLLM model, and we included random effects for LSOA in school just to account for clustering in these groups. So this is a quick overview of our policy results. I've just noticed the time and I'm meant to be 7 minutes, not quite in, but just to give you an overview, this is distances to primary children that at the LEA level. And I've just highlighted those local authorities that the proportion of children that live within a mile. And it's just to kind of show that there's kind of wide disparities. So in our more urban areas like Cardiff, we've got 72%. And then as we go to our more rural regions, only 40% live within a mile. And it's just an example of an LSOA map kind of outputs. We'll have different ways to mention the LSOA and school levels we are suppressing quite a bit due to small numbers. Our key findings from the stats is that in our unadjusted analysis, we saw what we expected, that people in travel further than private, people in rural areas travel further, and to Welsh medium travel further than English medium schools. But in our adjusted analyses, we actually found that a key difference for Welsh medium school in rural areas generally lived closer. But in urban areas, children travelling further for Welsh medium education. So there's a kind of school choice going on depending on whether you're in urban or rural areas. And other factors we found associated with greater home to school distance were living in most deprived areas, children with additional learning needs, attending a religious school. This was only in urban areas, but significantly further distances travelled to attend. Children recorded as non-white or other ethnicity in secondary age. And we also saw that as the age groups or the year groups increased through school, that the distance became further, which could suggest that parents move in to catchment zone and then maybe move away once their kids are in school. So just to finish, so I've rushed through that a bit. The home to school journey is one of the most frequent trips that a child will probably make in their week. And the distance that a child travels can have an impact on several key policy areas. So as well as transport and education, also health and also climate related policy. We've observed wide disparities in distances that children are travelling in Wales, and this highlights potential inequities in access that children have to education, opportunities for children to actually travel to school. And there's also potential there for transport poverty risks. So you have children that can't access necessary services because they can't afford to travel there. And as I've said at the start, the policy evidence is this is key baseline data to support evidence-based policy and interventions. To finish, we've got future work planned. We also have, as well as distance to attended school, distance to nearest school. So we want to start to look at what the factors associated with travelling further than your nearest school. We're linking to other data sets in SAIL, which I'll hand over to Dora shortly, which is then linking to self-reported travel behaviour to see how distance and behaviour are associated. And we also want to improve our shortest network distance models so we can start including other environmental metrics to build more realistic routes that children are travelling rather than just their shortest route. So thank you very much. I just wanted to acknowledge Public Health Wales and the Active Travel to School National Advisory Group. Both have been really involved in this and kind of providing stakeholder input and kind of guiding the research. But yeah, thank you. I rushed through that very quickly, but we're going to hand over to Dora now, who will talk about more about linking this data then to other data in SAIL. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Samantha. Over to you, Dora.
Can you see my slides now?
I can see them, but they're in presentation mode, presenter mode, for me at least. I don't know if that's the case for everybody.
Let me just see again.
Sorry.
That's all right. There we are.
Looks good.
Better now.
Thanks.
Yep.
Perfect. Thanks.
Thank you very much for joining this symposium today. So as Sam mentioned, I'll be presenting our work on how far adolescents are actively travelling to school in Wales. As has been already mentioned, active travel to school improves physical and mental health, boosts academic performance, reduces congestion and air pollution, increases social cohesion. Despite those benefits, international studies have reported in the last few years that there has been an decline in active travel to school among children and adolescents. In Wales, however, the percentage of secondary age children who either walk to school, cycle or scoot increased from 33.8% to 35% in 2021. So we'd like to explore this a bit further. Research has demonstrated that distance is a stronger factor influencing whether students are actively traveling to school or not, with shorter distances linked to high rates of active travel. There is limited evidence on how much or how far children are willing to travel, and our study aims to fill this gap by exploring patterns of active travel to school and identifying the threshold distance below which adolescents are more likely to actively travel to school, adjusting for sex, age, urban, rural, deprivation, and school type. To do this, we used the Student Health Wellbeing Survey from 2019-2020. The Student Health Wellbeing Survey is administered by the Student Health Research Network. It's conducted every 2 years, and it covers students from secondary schools aged 11 to 16 years old. We use data from the 2019 and 20 only to match the distance data that Sam has created. The original survey, I should mention, includes 198 schools and 119,000 students. However, due to three-level consent that is required for the survey, in SAIL we were able to access only the 32,558 children. We were able then to link those with the Wealth Demographic Service, as Sam mentioned, to include some demographic variables such as deprivation, as well as the Education Wales data sets to include some school type information, whether it was a faith school or the school language medium, as well as the distance data that Sam has just described for us. Our final cohort then consisted of 24,654 children aged 11 to 16. We included only those living in Wales and had linkable data. Oh, how do we go next? There we are. In terms of analysis, we used a multi-level logistic regression model to examine the relationship between active travel and distance. We controlled for sex, ethnicity, school level characteristics, as well as special education needs, physical activity, and the survey also includes a family affluence score. So we had more of an individualized level of affluence. We also used the ROC curve analysis to identify the threshold that best distinguishes between active and non-active travel. And to do that, we use the Uden index. In terms of sample characteristics, our sample characteristics were similar to the original sample. By original sample, I mean the one outside SAIL that's publicly available, the 119,000 students. And more information about this comparison can be found in a data insight that was published last week, and it's available through the ADR Wales and ADR UK website. In terms of our sample, which was the 32,000 students, we had slightly higher percentage of female students. There was a decline, consistent decline across the year groups. And also we had around 50% of the students coming from more affluent families. In terms of active travel, as shown here, active travel uptake declined with distance. So the more further away the student lived from school, the less likely they were to actively travel to school. And this is confirmed by the interquartile range on your right side of your screens, where those actively traveling to school had a median distance of 0.89 miles, so around 1 mile. And then those that did not actively travel to school had a median distance of 2.57 miles. Key findings. The main finding was that there was a sharp decline in active travel as distance increased. So children living 1 to 2 miles from school had the 85% lower odds of active travel versus those living 1 mile, less than a mile. And these odds increased as the distance increased as well. Girls were less likely to active travel to school, white children more likely to actively travel to school, as well as those that were physically active for 3 or more days a week. In terms of school type and language, those were not found to be significantly associated with active travel. In terms of deprivation, children in the least deprived areas and were less likely, and the less affluent families were more likely. In terms of model characteristics, school level differences explain 10% of the variability, and the neighborhood variability was explained by 25%. The index, the Newton index, so the threshold distance that we found was about 1.6 miles for boys and those living in rural areas. Not major differences for girls and those living in urban areas, around 1.5 miles. The area under the rock curve, as they call it, which distinguishes active travel with non-active travel, was 0.92, which shows that good discrimination between those two categories. Some major key points. This is the first study in Wales using a large sample, although we were able only to use the 32,000, still it's a large sample linked to objective distance data. Our findings show that distance is a key factor in active travel uptake, with boys, white children, those more physically active and those from less affluent or deprived areas being more likely to active travel to school. Compared to other countries, Wales has a higher threshold, for example, than Spain, which is 0.84 to 0.95 miles, but a slightly lower threshold than the US, which is 2.1 miles. This suggests that travel distances are not universal and should be analyzed geographically. And understanding these thresholds helps us tailor better interventions more effectively. Thank you very much, and I'll be happy to answer any questions, both me and Sam.
Perfect. Thanks both for your presentations. I'm not seeing any questions in the Q&A at the moment, but just as people kind of think about what you've been saying, I think it's interesting to see that some of the relationships that we saw in the Scotland researcher are replicated in yours, particularly around distance and a couple of the other factors. Thought I'd cheat a little bit and ask the question that Laura posed in the previous section, but it's quite early days, but have you had any discussions at kind of LA level about kind of implementing the insights? You point out that obviously there's a lot of policy potential here. Have you had any conversations about actually doing things based on the research so far?
Yeah, so we've had a lot of interest from Welsh Government around the Learner Travel Bill. So this is the free transport to school above 2 miles for primary and secondary. That's currently under consultation. So there is kind of interest in this data informing that bill. We've had kind of stakeholder involvement through the Active Travel Board and also Active Travel kind of groups. But I think at this stage, when we release, particularly for the distance school data, there are kind of caveats with it slightly, and it's the first time we're releasing school level and kind of lower level data. So I think it's more just an insight at the moment, and it's 2020 data. But when we can update that and we can feel more confident that the results are robust, I think there's real potential for it to inform.
Fantastic, thank you. And we have a question in as well now from Jemima. So highlighting, I think, children from less affluent families more likely to actively travel to school. So kind of interesting finding.
Yeah, it is interesting, but I think this kind of aligns with the deprivation as well. So children from more deprived areas are more likely to travel to school, and this is aligned with the less affluent families. I think in general, it has been found in the literature that children in the more deprived areas are more likely to be physically active, and there is the oxymoron, if you want, of the higher obesity rates, more physically active children. So I think that actually kind of agrees with our findings here.
Okay, thank you. And another question has just come in as well from Caro. Have you looked at any health benefits from active travel to school, or are you considering that in your work?
Yeah, we are considering that next step as well. Chris Dibben gave some nice ideas there, and we we have a, I think, cooperation in progress. So yeah, we're thinking about linking those with health records as well. Work in progress.
Fantastic. Well, look forward to reading more on this, and no doubt that'll be published as insights on the ADR website in due course. Welcome back, everybody. We'll move on to our next presentation, which is Professor Pia Hardelid, who is a Professor of Epidemiology at University College London. Her research focuses on how we can use linked admin data research into the epidemiology of respiratory infections in children and how the physical environment impacts on children's health, specifically insights from the Kids Environment and Health Cohort, a new national data resource. So Pia, over to you. You've got around 15 minutes for your presentation and then some questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Ian. I will try to share my slides. I did get the blue screen of death earlier, so let's hope my laptop holds out.
Crossed. Good luck.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, let's be positive. Okay, can you see this in a normal mode now?
Yes.
You can just, okay, wonderful.
All good.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. I'm going to talk about the Kids Environment and Health Cohort, which is an ADR UK data investment. And I'll tell you a little bit about the cohort, why we're setting it up and where we are in terms of progress. And we are very, very keen to hear from people who want to use it because we think it's going to be great. So why do we need the Kids Environment and Health Cohort? Well, I think you are all here because you realise that we are all living through an unprecedented environmental crisis, actually. We are living through, we have a climate crisis, we have very sort of changing pollution landscape globally, and we're also living through a biodiversity collapse. And these three things are already having health impacts. And the WHO, in fact, estimates that 90% of the morbidity burden of climate change will fall on children under the age of 15 years old, even though they represent only 25% of the world's population. So we really need sort of better evidence for how children will be impacted by climate change as they're growing up, because those who are children now will live through many more years than people like me of extreme weather. And how is this going to affect their health, our economies, all these sorts of things. So we really need very good data to get some numbers on that. So there was given sort of large health burden of climate change on children, you'd think that there was lots of data already, but this is a scoping review looking at the health impacts of climate change on children. And they actually found that, so they found quite a large number of articles. I think it was 371, but actually the vast majority of articles they found in the original search, they didn't focus on children at all. And maybe a lot of the studies just included children as a subpopulation. Many studies look at the impact of extreme weather on all-cause, all-age mortality. So, that is not really relevant to the vast majority of children because the vast majority of people who die are older. The other thing that their review highlighted is, of course, that if you are already living through disadvantage, you are more likely to have a higher health burden from climate change. But importantly, from a research point of view, they show that there's a clear lack of longitudinal studies looking at the impact of climate change on children's health from before birth and then as they are growing up into adulthood. And that's really what we are trying to discuss. So why does that matter? Well, this study is where the researchers looked at national climate change adaptation policies from 160 countries. And they searched through these and looked for any mention of sort of child relevant policies across, and they identified some 19 domains that were relevant to children's health, and they found actually that 28% of the countries they surveyed, their policies didn't include anything that was relevant to children at all, and 31% of the other countries only included sort of one domain out of 19. So, you know, the fact that we have very little evidence on how climate change is going to affect children means that adaptation policies are just not relevant to children's health at all. So we really need to change that. And finally, just hinting at why I spoke to Chris about earlier, is that children and families with children are by far the poorest groups in society. This is data from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation using households below average income data. And you can see that this is data for the last 30 years. You can see that pensioners used to be the second poorest group in society, and they are now by far the wealthiest. Whereas children has consistently been the poorest group. So, you know, given what the scoping review found about the health impacts of climate change falling on people who are children who are already deprived, this lack of data is really really quite significant. We really need to do something about it. So you've already heard the amazing data that's available in Wales and Scotland. Linking environmental data to health data, that landscape looks quite different in England. So there are a number of really brilliant cohort studies that have been used to sort of recruited cohort studies that have been used very successfully to look at the impact on environmental conditions on children's health and education. So that's things like Born in Bradford and Alspach. So they're both you know, locally recruited study in Bradford and Bristol. And then the Millennium Cohort Study, which is UK-wide, but the vast majority of children live in England. But what we don't have is what you've already heard that they have in Wales and Scotland. We have no linked administrative data resource for environmental child's health research. And we want to change that because we believe that linked national administrative data are awesome for doing this kind of research. And of course you're here because many of you have experience in using administrative data already, but there are just really, really important strengths in terms of being able to use national administrative data and linking environmental data to children's health and education data on a national scale for research purposes. So for example, you know already that in administrative data, when they're national, we really minimize bias and loss to follow-up, which is great. But more specifically for environmental health studies, we can sort of more precisely estimate small relative risks. So many of the risks that we are interested in are, they can be sort of like an odds ratio, for example, 1.03 or something, looking at the association between a type of pollution and an adverse birth outcome, for example. But if loads and loads of children and pregnant women are exposed to an environmental stressor, you can still end up with very large population attributable fractions. So we need to be able to estimate that accurately. So England is a much bigger country, as you all know, than Wales and Scotland. And it's a much more diverse country in terms of its population, but also in terms of the environmental risk. And given that it's such a large country and so diverse, we can also look at and estimate the risk of exposure to certain environmental stresses or certain types of pollution on particularly vulnerable children. So, for example, children with rare or complex disease, you need very, very large samples to be able to do that. And the other things we can do is we can use study designs like sibling control designs to adjust for confounding, particularly confounding by socioeconomic status, which is very, very pervasive in environmental epidemiology studies. But again, you need very large studies to be able to do that. And of course, when we have national data over a long period of time, we can also evaluate interventions across time and place, and also compare, for example, similar areas, statistically similar areas, but where one area's had the intervention and one hasn't. So that's why we're setting up the Kids Environment and Health Cohort with ADR UK funding, and we're working very closely with the Office for National Statistics to do this. So everything I'm going to say from here on is in the in our database protocol, but we have some updates as well since that was written and published. So the Kids Environment and Health Cohort will be a national administrative data birth cohort. of all children born in England since 2006. So the spine consists of birth records linked to death records for those children, and the spine importantly includes all births, so both still and live births, which is really, really important, because if you think about if you're interested in environmental exposures operating or operating during pregnancy, if we don't take into account the fact that some children aren't born, then we might end up with biased results. So it's really important to have stillbirths in the cohort as well. And the data will be de-identified and linked to national environmental data. It will be longitudinal, so children can be followed up from birth, and it will be annually updated. So these are some of the, oh, the S has fallen off there, but these are the data sources that we're using. So the spine is made up of birth registration and death registrations, and then there will also be linked to birth notifications eventually. We will link to, or ONS are linking to maternal census data, longitudinal address records to be able to evaluate environmental exposures over time as pregnant women and children move. Health data from hospital records and maternity services data, national pupil data that very similar to what you've already heard about from Wales, and then a number of environmental data sets which I'll tell you about later. So this is sort of the structure of the cohort. So the spine, as I said, is birth records and birth notifications that will then be linked sort of backwards in time to their mother's maternity services data, maternal hospital records up to a year before birth, and then 2011 and 2021 census records for children born within 2 years of the each of those censuses. We will have health and education data, and then mortality data, and then really uniquely for England, the children will be linked to longitudinal address records by the ONS, and so, you know, for the first time it will be possible, as has been possible in Wales and Scotland before, to link environmental data to the child's to each address where the child has lived, so you can develop a sort of a national exposome record for each child. And then of course children also, as we've heard, also spend a lot of time in school, so it will be possible to link those environmental data also to school locations, but researchers will never be able to see specifically the UPRNs or the actual school locations. They will be held separately by ONS. So this is a very complex data linkage project, and we started in 2023. And stage one, because of challenges of linking to health data in England that many of you are already aware of, we will be delivering this a cohort in stages. So stage one will be the spine, birth and death records, maternal census data, and then environmental data linked to the birth certificate or the address listed on the birth record. Stage 2A will be linked education data and environmental data linked to longitudinal address histories. And then stage 2B, which is led by ONS, is to link to health outcome data. So, and this slide shows you sort of the data linkage that's been done for stage one, and the type of linkage that's been used. So the environmental and dwelling level data will be linked deterministically. Death registrations have been linked deterministically as well, but the census linkage is more complicated because, of course, the census doesn't have NHS numbers on it. So they're using both deterministic and probabilistic linkage. So they're using SPLINK for the probabilistic linkage. And these are the environmental and dwelling level data that will be linked to the Kids Environment Health cohort. So this is valuation office agency property attribute data. So that's data from council tax records. It's got information about the age of the building and number of rooms. Then DEFRA air pollution data, Met Office temperature data, energy performance certificate data, which has got more data on each property, including, you know, type of windows, type of roof, type of heating, etc., but it's not available for all properties. Then we're really excited that ONS are going to link to ordnance data that they have developed together with ordnance surveys on access to private green space, and also distance to public green spaces using a number of indicators. So these data will be held in the ONS Secure Research Service, and phase 1 will be available in the SRS from April 26, and phase 2 it's not clear at the moment when that will be available. As you know, the SRS is a 5 safes TRE, and researchers will be required to take secure research training to access the data and comply with any extra conditions. For example, through PPI work that we've done, parents are really keen that each researcher produces a research summary about what they're going to do, and then also a research summary about what they have done. So, and we've done a lot of public involvement and engagement for this project. We've taken part in various events. We have developed Key Stage 2 material about environmental epidemiology that's available on the TES website. I took part in a podcast. We're quite active on social media, particularly Instagram, and I wrote a blog about for ADR UK website about our public engagement journey. And this is all of our social media, etc., and websites. Please have a look at the website and do email us if you're interested in using the data. We're very keen to hear from you, and I'm very happy to take questions. And yeah, just really, really grateful to ADR UK for this investment. And I also want to thank all the colleagues at UCL and our collaborators, and everyone at ONS has been brilliant at this as well, supporting this. So thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Even. Yeah, that's great. Thanks. Got a question just come in from Laura. Really interested in the research summaries the parents have asked for. How will you produce and share those?
Well, the researchers using the resource will be producing them themselves. It's not that will be them, and they will have to commit to doing that when they want to use the data. We have, however, produced a document together with 5 parents about how to write research summaries, and it's pretty much ready to go. So Laura will be in contact about that very soon. And that was because parents, when we did sort of public involvement about the cohorts, parents said, yeah, well, you know, that's great, you can link the data, that's fine, but we really want to know about the research findings. It's really hard for us to find research findings, and when it's published on BBC or whatever, it's really hard to find the paper, it's hard to access the paper. So we want really good, like, empowering summaries of what we can do based on your research findings to improve health for our children. So that's sort of why we did that. But it will be researchers that will need to publish those. They'll need to be available on the Kids Environment Health Cohort website, and also possibly also on the ONS website, but we'll have to discuss that with ONS. But yeah.
Thanks. Any other questions for Pia about the research, the work that's being done? Nothing further, I'm afraid, Pia, from the colleague. Thanks for presenting today. I think everyone will be anticipating the results of this when they come through.
Well, just to say, this isn't a result, you know, this is a database resource that ADR UK have made available. So I obviously want to use it, but we're really keen that people here, if they have research ideas, you know, they will be available to access it will be possible to access the data from April 26. So, you know, please think of things you could use the data for. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks again, Pia. Great. So last but not least, we're on to another double act for our last speakers. So this time we have Dr. Neil Rowland and Dr. Babak Jahanshahi, both so Senior Research Fellow and Research Fellow, both at Queen's Business School at Queen's University, Belfast. They'll be talking to us today about their work on the effects of outdoor air pollution on the mortality and health in Northern Ireland. So Neil and Babak, it's over to you. You've got around 15 minutes for your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you see my slides okay?
Looking good. Over to you. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to come and speak this afternoon. So myself and my colleague Babak are going to talk about some of the work we've been doing with ADR Northern Ireland, which is all about using linked administrative data to try and understand the impact of outdoor air pollution on people's health. So the issue of air pollution ties in really quite closely with wider climate concerns. You know, many of the things that we do day to day not only contribute to greenhouse gas emissions, but contribute to air pollution, which can damage our health. So globally, outdoor air pollution, and specifically particulate matter pollution, is the second leading risk factor for early death and poor health. In the UK, it's considered the leading environmental risk factor for public health. And over a number of decades, we've learned a lot more about the damaging effects of air pollution on our health. And in large part, this has been due to a growth in studies that have been made possible by linkages between different data sets. So linking health data from health systems, hospitals, mortality records, linking those to measures of air pollution exposure. And so those newly available linkages really allow us to characterize, first of all, population exposure. So we can see where air pollution affects people in the population most. We can identify vulnerable groups. And then, of course, it allows us to estimate the health impacts. So I've got a map there which just gives an example of the sort of things that you can do when you link these two types of data sets together. So this is an example of linking air pollution data to maternity services data in Northern Ireland. And it shows the spatial distribution of air pollution exposure among pregnant women in Northern Ireland. So you can see urban areas, for example, tend to have higher levels of pollution. And in fact, when you drill further down into the data, you can see that among those pregnant women, it's women living in more deprived areas that have the highest levels of exposure. And so this is an example of the kind of thing that you can do when you link these type of data together. Now, more specifically, in terms of this project, we are examining a number of different research questions and using some various sources of data. So, for example, we're looking at, in one project, data from the Northern Ireland longitudinal study, which is a 28% random sample of the Northern Ireland population. It contains census data, which is all anonymized, and Northern Ireland is quite unique in that it has much more detailed health information, self-reported health information compared to the other regions of the UK. Also included in one of our projects is prescriptions data. So if you receive a prescription from your GP that's dispensed in a community pharmacy. And so with this individual level data, you can then link it to air pollution data. So if you look on the left-hand side, this is the DEFRA annual average air pollution data that Pia referred to. And essentially what happens is all individuals living in households in the same 1 kilometre grid square are assigned the same level of pollution for a particular year. So it's matching up, connecting individual level health and other information with these home address air pollution measures. And so what you end up with then is a fictional data set on the bottom right. So you have 5 individuals, you know something about their demographic characteristics, you have a measure of health, and you have a measure of air pollution exposure. And so what we do with this data is carry out statistical analysis. So we want to know, do the individuals with the higher levels of exposure to air pollution tend to report or have worse health, even when you adjust for other risk factors like age that can impact health and that may be associated with air pollution. Now my colleague Babak is going to talk about some of the findings from these different projects. But before he does, I'll just discuss some of the ways in which we've engaged with different groups and different people throughout the course of this project. So at the minute, it ties in very closely with environmental policy in Northern Ireland. So Northern Ireland's department responsible for the environment is currently working on a clean air strategy. So our results have helped to inform our responses to that and the responses of different charity organisations, for example. We've also engaged with the officials responsible for drafting that strategy. Another thing we did is created a dashboard which maps our pollution data for Northern Ireland. So this is a freely available tool that anyone can use, and it basically packages up these data in a way that anyone can interact with, so they can explore how our quality varies depending on where they're living, where they're working, etc. And then we've also more widely engaged with the public and different organisations as well as local government. So we've organised workshops, symposium. We've also worked with charities on a report looking at the mortality burden of our pollution, not only in Northern Ireland but in the Republic of Ireland. And then we've tried to engage through local press, for example, as well as the different levels of government, to try and really demonstrate just how valuable this data is in trying to understand something that we previously knew nothing about in Northern Ireland. So I'd now like to hand over to my colleague Babak. He's going to talk about just some of the research findings that we've produced so far.
Thank you, Neil. Okay, I guide you through some of our publications. The first one is published last year in Health Economics journal, titled Prenatal Exposure to Particular Matter and Infant Birth Outcomes, Evidence from a Population-Wide Database. This study uses data on all births in Northern Ireland from 2011 to 2017 to examine whether infants with higher prenatal PM2.5 exposure experience worse birth outcomes. The birth data are sourced from NIMATS, Northern Ireland Maternity Service, which compiles demographic and clinical information on mothers and infants from antenatal checkups, delivery, and postnatal periods. NIMATS data were linked with PM2.5 pollution levels annually for each postcode based on the mother's address at the time of birth. We modeled birth outcomes such as birth weight, placental health, Apgar scores, among other birth outcomes, as a function of PM2.5 exposure during pregnancy. In our regression analysis, we adjusted for different factors, risk factors such as maternal characteristics, including age, employment status, relationship status, number of previous pregnancies, infant sex, as well as environmental variables such as rainfall and temperature. In our most robust modeling approach, we used the mother fixed effect model, which comparing outcomes among siblings born at different times and thus exposed to varying level of PM2.5 in utero. This approach accounts for unmeasured factors common to siblings. And when we use this method, we found very limited evidence that PM2.5 exposure affect birth outcomes. This contrasts with the stronger associations we observed in conventional unadjusted and adjusted models that do not employ mother fixed effect approach. However, we find this approach the most reliable one. In the second paper, titled Long-Term Exposure to Ambient PM2.5 and Population Health, Evidence from Link Census Data. This paper used linkage data from Northern Ireland longitudinal study, NILS, which linked with the grid score annual mean population data published by Dora, as Neil mentioned. NILs contain biannual residential address information and a very rich set of personal and household level information from censuses, both census 2001 and 2011. We examined the self-reported health impacts of long-term PM2.5 exposure in Northern Ireland by conducting a multivariate analysis in the form of cross-sectional linear regression. The results from this paper indicate that 1 microgram per cubic meter increase in long-term PM2.5 exposure is associated with elevated probabilities of poor health across most available health outcomes in the models which are not adjusted for other variables. But there are 5 outcomes, namely poor general health, chronic illness, breathing difficulties, deafness, and mobility difficulties. These outcomes remain statistically significant after a statistical adjustment for other confounders, and also they survive most other robustness checks that we did. In addition, we find some evidences that older age groups are more vulnerable to air pollution exposure. And the last paper I am talking about today is just published on Nature Partnership Journal for Parkinson's disease last week. And this one utilized the NILs linked with air pollution and prescription data sets. In this paper, we employed Cox's proportional hazard model to understand if exposure to pollutants explain the onset of Parkinson's disease in Northern Ireland. The onset of Parkinson's disease measured by getting prescription for Parkinson's disease based on BNF codes related to Parkinson's disease. We found no significant association between exposure to PM2.5 and NO2 and Parkinson's disease onset in the overall population. However, there was some tentative evidence of a positive association for the group under 50 years of age. For that, we discussed some etiological and non-etiological explanation in the paper. We also write a report commissioned by both British Heart Foundation and Irish Heart Foundation for the island of Ireland. In the report, we show that we estimated that approximately 700 premature deaths are related to air pollution in the Republic of Ireland and 900 in Northern Ireland, among which 300 are linked to cardiovascular disease. To sum up, our research to date indicates that exposure to air pollution likely poses significant health risks for several outcomes, even in a relatively low exposure context of Northern Ireland. We have found evidence that exposure to pollutants such as PM2.5 is linked to excess mortality and morbidity across several health conditions, including poor general health, chronic illness, breathing difficulty, deafness, mobility difficulties, etc. For some other outcomes, however, we found no effect in this context. And that's me. Thank you very much. This is just like knowledge data providers and ADRs for the funding. So we are writing open for questions now.
Many thanks to you both for your presentation. Sure, certainly. Absolutely. I'm just struggling with the Q&A function on my computer. It's not loading. I don't know if Laura, you can see any questions there.
Thanks, Ian. Yeah, I had a question actually. I was just wondering if the presenters could share a little bit more about the dashboard, just sort of how that's been received and what kind of engagement you've seen with it so far.
Sure. So I didn't, to my shame, I didn't provide a link in the slides, but it allows people to type in their postcode, and it'll tell the user about air pollution levels in their area, so they can see how they change through time, how they compare with different areas. So we've had a number of organizations interested in it. So some charities, for example, have cited the dashboard in their responses to consultations on traffic policies, for example. I also went on Northern Ireland Radio to talk about the dashboard, and it's been covered in different press outlets. For example, every winter there's usually spikes of air pollution, and so there's quite a bit of interest in the dashboard when those things appear and when those issues appear in the news.
Okay, thanks. Okay, I just had a question kind of following on from that really. Your slide, Neil, earlier on we talked about the engagement through the future rather into engagement.
Sorry, I couldn't. Sorry, you broke up a bit there. I wasn't able to hear
apologies.
the question.
I'm just going to ask on the engagement side of things, your slide talked about engagement so far, and obviously you talked a bit there about the dashboard as well. Just wondered if you had any plans for kind of further engagement that you'd like to share or could share with us today, like plans for the future.
Sure. Well, the clean air strategy that I mentioned is undergoing another round of consultation, hopefully towards the end of the year. So we're hoping to engage in that respect, but there's lots of other different projects that we're thinking of to try and widen the engagement. So, for example, for a lot of people interested in how like air pollution and the arts can be used to engage with people. So lots of different options. So kind of watch this space, I guess.
Fantastic. Good feedback on the chat for your dashboard. So keep up the good work, I think would be the thing to say there. Any further questions from anyone or colleagues from Queen's University of Belfast?
There's one more question in the Q&A. I'm not sure if you can
sorry.
lay it in, but I can read it out.
Sorry.
If not,
no, please do. Sorry. Oh, I see it now. From Pierre. Thanks to your presentation. There's another vote in favour of the dashboard. Air pollution is declining in the UK, which is great. Is there any plans to examine other forms of pollution or environmental threats?
Babak, would you like to?
I tried to find the question because the line dropped. I couldn't hear it. Sorry, 1 second.
I mean, shall I just ask it because I can?
Yes,
yes,
please.
Yeah.
Thank
so
you
air pollution is declining. There's been, massive declines in air pollution over the last 50 years, which is fantastic public health news. And I think people are very aware of air pollution now. So a lot of people actually think it's increasing, which is not.
But I was just gonna. Again, it's okay. The question is about. Sure, go ahead.
Yes. Sorry, I don't know what's going on now, to be honest. But anyway, I was going to ask, are you planning to look at other environmental threats like water pollution or extreme weather or, and any other sort of forms that are becoming more...
So for this line, strands of research we are doing, the focus was on air pollution only. And although it's declining and although it's quite a low context pollution compared to other studies in the Northern Ireland context, but we still, find some evidences that is still harmful to human health. And besides, I didn't mention it, but the World Health Organization have a threshold of 5 microgram per cubic meter for PM2.5, above which considers unhealthy for human health. And almost everywhere in the Republic and Northern Ireland counties, we are above that threshold as well. So although it is a low context of exposure, but still it's above the threshold most places considered by World Health Organization. But at the moment, I think this is the sense of research we focus on air pollution. I don't know, Neil, you want to add anything on this? Oh.
No, I guess it's kind of dependent on the data. So there's a lot more interest now in like the types of particulate matter that might have different health effects. So that data isn't really readily available at the minute, but that's something that potentially in future we might be able to examine.
Sorry, it's stuttered there. Did you just mention NOx? Sorry. There's a question that's just coming about interested in PM2, but also plans to expand to NOx and the like, which is quite a similar question. So I think you just covered that, but it's been stuttering. Sorry.
Yeah, so we in the dashboard we can actually look at NO2, nitrogen dioxide, as well as PM2.5, and those are kind of the two key pollutants from a public health point of view that people tend to be interested in. So you can look at both. Yeah.
Perfect. Thanks for the answers to the user's question. Any other questions before we wrap up? Well, thanks for backing for your presentation. Indeed, to all the other presentations we've heard today, we've heard about 4 very interesting research projects using admin data linkage from across all 4 nations of the UK, and also some good questions from participants around engagement in terms of potentially unexpected findings, things about topography and buffer zones, as well as engagement with local authorities on the use of insights gained through linkage, as well as sharing knowledge with parents, as well as where some of these projects might go next. Do follow ADR UK's work through their website, their newsletter and social media channels. Also to note, it might be of interest to people on the call that the ONS will be launching a topic consultation on the 2031 census on the 28th of October, which will run until February. And colleagues here, we're working closely with the devolved governments to ensure consistency across the UK, and the results will directly inform decisions about census content. Finally, if you're interested in our research work at the ONS, do keep an eye on our release calendar over the next few weeks. We've got quite a few releases coming up over that period. You can sign up for a newsletter by emailing us. I've popped it into the chat. And just to finish up today, thanks again for having me as your chair. Thanks again for joining us today, and do enjoy the rest of your day and stay in touch with these projects as they continue to develop. All the best. Thanks. Bye.